All right. Well, welcome everyone. My name is Sarah Rathman. I'm the Director of Marketing Communications here at Dry Creek Vineyard, and I'm very excited to be joined with our Associate Winemaker, Brian Pruett, today. It's great to see everyone's smiling faces. This is a really fun tasting, the Mariner Vertical. This is something that we get asked constantly. What's the difference between vintage to vintage? How long can I age them? What's really the story behind the Mariner? Why do we do this? So many questions. So we thought it'd be really fun to have this. And I think you guys are just going to have an amazing time with Brian here. A couple housekeeping things, just a reminder, we're going to keep everybody on mute for now. Not that we don't love your singing voices, but we want to make sure that everybody can hear what Brian has to say. We are going to go ahead and turn on the live transcript. I'm going to enable the auto transcription. So if you need that option, please feel free to use that. We are going to go ahead and I'm going to let you know right up front in case anybody has to drop off. I'll remind you at the end, but our next virtual tasting is going to be on our 50th anniversary wines. So our 50th anniversary Cabernet and our 50th anniversary Sparkling Chenin, if you haven't opened those up already. So make sure that you sign up for that. And then without further ado, because it seems like everyone's here, everybody ready to start tasting some wine? A little head nod. I see a couple head nods, mostly. I hope so. What are we doing here if we're not? So go ahead and introduce Brian to go ahead and take it away for us.
All righty. Thank you, Sarah. Well, I am just as excited about this as Sarah is. These are the Mariner is one of my favorite wines that we make, and I think this is maybe the best way to look at the Mariner, looking at 3 vintages back to back to back. I know a lot of you are probably pretty familiar with our background with making Bordeaux style wines and making the Mariner in particular. I want to do a quick little intro on kind of how the Mariner came about. How did we even get here? So, our Bordeaux style program and our Meritage program really began, with Dave. Like the whole winery began with Dave, and his inspiration to start the winery came from his travels around Europe. And he really grew to love the great red wines of the Bordeaux region. So, he tasted around Bordeaux, France, fell in love with that, came to Dry Creek Valley and knew that this was an area where Bordeaux varietals would do really well. And the acreage of Cabernet Sauvignon and the accompanying Bordeaux varietals has really grown throughout the 50 years that the winery has been around. Dave was inspired to make these great red wines that were made in Bordeaux. Unfortunately, back in the, prior to basically 1987, 1988, you could really only call these wines red wine or red table wine. So Dave and Dry Creek Vineyard, we became the founding members of the Meritage Alliance, and we created this term Meritage. And many of you may already know this, but the word is the combination of the word merit and heritage. So the merit of the grape or the merit of the wine that's made from those grapes, meaning, hey, these are very quality grapes, quality wines. And then, the heritage, the history and the tradition of blending wines together to make the best possible wine you can from a given vintage. So there was no name for it. So they came up with this, and they really wanted something that sounded good to represent these fantastic wines that these wineries are making. So we still agree that Meritage is much better sounding than red table wine. So, fast forward to 2006, we had been making Meritage wines, really since the 70s, and then in the late 80s and through the 90s, we were able to actually call them Meritage. But you fast forward to 2006, and that was when we kind of transitioned from Dave being the first generation owner to Kim and Don, with that second generation really taking the lead at the winery. And so one of the things they wanted to do was really create a premier Meritage blend and really elevate our Meritage and Bordeaux program as a whole. And so that was when they created the Mariner. So they really wanted to make a wine that used all 5 of those noble Bordeaux varietals. So those 5 varietals, many of you may know this, but it's Cabernet Sauvignon, Merlot, Cabernet Franc, Malbec, and Petit Verdot. A Meritage doesn't need to have all 5, but when they set out to make this real next level Meritage blend, they thought it was important to include all 5 varietals in some form or fashion. And, as this wine has evolved over time, there really is an important place in this blend, vintage after vintage, for every one of those varietals. And we'll kind of get into that as we move along. The Mariner is kind of our left bank version. So in Bordeaux, France, they have the left bank and the right bank. The left bank is generally based in Cabernet Sauvignon. So Cabernet Sauvignon is usually the largest percentage varietal of the five, while using the accompanying varieties to help make the blend as good as it can be. The right bank is Merlot is typically the leading varietal in those right bank blends. And for us, we make what we call the Meritage, which is that original bottling. So our Meritage is kind of our right bank Merlot based red wine. And then the Mariner that we're tasting today is sort of that left bank, with Cabernet Sauvignon being the lead varietal. Okay, so that's kind of how we got to Mariner. Now we're looking at the vintages 2017, 2018, and 2019. This is 3 really great years. I'm really excited about these 3 that we're tasting. I'm just going to kind of go through each one a little bit. I'm also going to smell and taste and enjoy myself to kind of be right there with you along for the experience.
Well, in 2017, isn't that like a personal connection kind of year for you? Am I doing the math correctly?
Yes, you are. Yeah. So 2017 was my first vintage at the winery. So this is kind of a fun lineup for me, because it's the first 3 years I've been at the winery in my first 3 vintages. 2017 was a really nice growing year. Kind of became a challenging harvest because of some of the warm weather we had. So 2017 was kind of a warmer year in general. We had a heat spike at the end of August and beginning of September. It really accelerated ripening. For us, we tend to harvest our grapes a little earlier than other wineries. So we try to keep our sugars relatively low, alcohol's moderate. And, a word that I say a lot, I'm going to say a lot today. And, for many of you that have spent some time with me, I say the word balance a lot. And balance is a really important word that when we describe our wines, and it's really foundational for how Tim and I make harvest decisions and blending decisions, and ultimately want these wines to be balanced. So we don't want them to get too ripe. We want to harvest them a little earlier, where they have a lot of natural acidity, they have a lot of complexity, and you don't just have a high alcohol wine with residual sugar that's really kind of one-dimensional. And the Mariner is a wine that's really important with, and I think we've executed that in each of these vintages. 2017, the one we're tasting first, was a little bit more challenging with that heat spike. It really accelerated the ripening, and with making wine and dealing with harvest, you really need to hustle to keep up with that warmer weather. Fortunately for us, we were already started harvesting. So some wineries had a little bit more of a challenge where they were kind of waiting for grapes to get a little riper, and then that hot weather comes, and then you're kind of already behind the 8 ball. For us, we had already been well on our way harvesting Sauvignon Blanc and Zinfandel. And so we really were moving along quite nicely. And with these Bordeaux varietals, these 5 varietals we're talking about, they ripen a little bit later in the season. And so that heat spike didn't really push them over the hill, but it may have affected some of your earlier ripening varieties. So we kind of stayed ahead, had a lot of those varieties harvested, and it really cleared the way so that when Cabernet Sauvignon, Merlot, Cabernet Franc, when these varietals were ready to be harvested, we were ready to get them off the vine and bring them into the winery in just the right time. So with it being a warmer year, you see plenty of full fruit, plenty of maturity, a lot of really nice dark flavors. And with this being 2017, it's been in the bottle a few years. So the tannins have really softened a little bit. A lot of that, some of that brighter acidity and maybe a little bit of edge on that tannin has really rounded out and softened. There's a little bit more complexity there as well. Yeah, it's tasting great, and there's still some bright acidity there. There's still a little grip on the tannin, which means this is going to hold up in the bottle even longer. That's a common question that we get, is kind of like, how long can these wines age for? When should I open it? It's always a tough question to answer because a lot of it's personal preference. With the 2017 here, I'm still seeing a lot of fresh fruit that we had when we bottled the wine. So it really hasn't broken down much in the bottle. It's aged nicely. It's retained a lot of its freshness, but it's a little softer in the palate. The edges have rounded out a little bit. So that's developing very, very nicely. Um, I'll move on to the 2018 here next, but we have a lot. We like to have a lot of consistency with the Mariner, and so some of these statistics are very similar. Like so, the 2017, it's 42% new oak. This wine is aged in French and Hungarian oak. So the French Hungarian is going to be a common thing on the wine, vintage to vintage. 42%. We're usually 40 to 45, 46% new oak on this wine. And so that's kind of our sweet spot. These three vintages are no different. We were able to keep the alcohol very moderate at 14.2%. And talking about that ageability, the pH was 3.58. So those are all just numbers that I'm throwing at you. But basically, by keeping the acid at a high enough level, it keeps the pH low enough, which means the wine stays healthy, it stays fresh, and it's not going to fall apart in the bottle. So pretty excited about the 2017. And even with, and we'll see more of this on the 2018, even with the warmer year in 2017, there's still some herbal notes, some leather, some complexity there in the 2017 that I'm personally really, really happy about. I should talk about you guys probably saw it on the label because our marketing team does such a wonderful job developing these beautiful labels. There's a lot of information packed into the label on the Mariner. So the varietal breakdown, and this is something I want to touch on for the 2017 because it kind of ties in as we go vintage to vintage. So varietal breakdown on the 2017 is 69% Cabernet Sauvignon, 15% Merlot, 6% Cabernet Franc, 5% Malbec, and 5% Petit Verdot. So like I said, kind of in the beginning, we're always going to have Cabernet Sauvignon be the leader of this wine. That was kind of an evolution, starting with the 2004 vintage and moving along. But really the last 5, 8, 10 vintages, we found that we kind of like that Cabernet Sauvignon to be a little bit higher there and kind of in that 60 to 70% is a sweet spot. We've had some years where we get down into the 55% range, but that 60 to 70% is something we've been really happy with, and it really kind of showcases the Dry Creek Valley on a given vintage. Merlot is always going to be the next varietal. We just think Cabernet Sauvignon and Merlot really blend well together. Merlot is a little softer tannin, a little brighter acidity. Merlot brings a lot of the sort of red fruit, kind of a little bit more red cherry, maybe some raspberry, some cranberry. It kind of brings some of that into the mix. Whereas Cabernet Sauvignon is a little more black currant, black cherry, blackberry, kind of more masculine brooding tannins. Cabernet Franc and Merlot are a little, and Malbec are a little more refined, softer tannins, whereas Cabernet Sauvignon and Petit Verdot are kind of bigger structure, darker color, more heft to them. And so we kind of will tweak those blends a little bit from year to year because we really want to have the best possible Meritage, the best possible Bordeaux style blend in a given vintage. We also want it to be consistent. And so we're going to look at that right here and see where there will be some differences from vintage to vintage because we're dealing with Mother Nature, but there's also a kind of a signature characteristic that the wine has. And I think we've achieved that across these 3 years, even though generally 2017 was a little bit of a warmer year as a whole, 2018 a little cooler, 2019 was kind of moderate, but with plenty of warmth and during the growing season to get the grapes fully ripe. And we'll kind of touch on that throughout. So unless Sarah, you have anything you want to jump in, I'm going to move on to the 2018. I don't know if I've missed any questions along the way.
No, but I wasn't sure if you want to talk, I don't know if you're going to do it now or later, but maybe just on the vineyard selection of kind of what makes the Mariner so special, of how you kind of approach the blending for this particular wine as opposed to other wines that we have.
Yeah, no, that is a very good point. So the Mariner is always one of the first blends that we do. So we have some wines that are sourced from specific vineyards. Like a lot of us are very familiar with the Endeavor, which is a single vineyard. All the grapes are coming from the Endeavor. We also have our terroir series of wines that focus on specific subregions within the Dry Creek Valley. and some of the vineyards within that region. The Mariner is blended and made right alongside of those, and often we will actually make the Mariner first. We do have to be selective with having some special barrels of the Endeavor vineyard set aside specifically for that wine, but we always like to have a little bit of that Endeavor vineyard influence the Mariner as well, both with the Cabernet Sauvignon and especially the Petit Verdot. The Petit Verdot that comes off that Endeavor DCV9 vineyard is just phenomenal. Tons of dark color, really, really nice structure. And it's just a wonderful, we make a single bottling of that, but it's a wonderful blending component in Endeavor, and it's a huge part of the Mariner, even though it can range from a couple percent to 5%. We're looking at 2 to 5% across these 3 vintages, but it's important nonetheless. Consistency, like I was talking about earlier, the Vineyard Sources are also consistent. There's a lot of data I keep track of on all these wines, and so I have some information in front of me, and Vineyard Sources are very consistent year to year. DCV9, like I talked about, Handel Denier, Voganson, Puma Springs, DCV6, Long. There's a lot of these vineyards are in it year after year after year. So we have a lot of wonderful Cabernet Sauvignon, both our vineyard and some growers we source from throughout the valley. DCV6, one of our estate vineyards, which if you guys have been out to the winery, it's right across the street here. That's where we get the Cabernet Franc and the Malbec. Just wonderful grapes, wonderful growing site there. That it's kind of that first, what we call the Eastern benchland. As you move from the valley floor and you head east, away from the valley floor up the hillside to the east, we call those the Eastern benchland, and it's kind of a shelves and benches that climb up away from the valley. And our DCV6 vineyard, with where we're located in the valley, is kind of that first shelf, and it's just a phenomenal growing site for Cabernet Franc and for Malbec. Wonderfully balanced fruit, plenty of sunshine and warmth for the varietals get fully ripe. But with the way the vines are along that sort of, it's kind of sort of a bowl as that hill goes down, they don't get hit too hard with the afternoon sunlight, because as the sun kind of goes up middle of the day, and then afternoon in the growing season, we're looking at July, August, September, really warm sunny afternoons. You kind of want to use the vine, sort of uses those leaves and use itself to shade itself and protect the fruit. And so that vineyard was planted in a way where the fruit isn't getting direct afternoon sunlight. That allows the grapes to ripen moderately, and it kind of a slow and steady progression to finally getting harvested, rather than getting hit with sun and turning to raisins and you lose all that wonderful flavor and complexity. So really consistent fruit sourcing for those varietals. We talked about Petit Verdot, and then Merlot. There's a couple growers that we work with throughout the valley. One of them is the Long family. We've been sourcing Merlot from that vineyard for, I think we're beyond 30 years from just that same vineyard. So it's been, we're celebrating 50 years this year. We have our own long-standing vineyards, but there's a lot of these long-standing relationships that we've had. And so when you have people like the Longs that you've been working with for so many years, it almost is like another estate vineyard. We're so familiar with the site, we're so familiar with the people, that there's a lot of consistency with what we're getting from that vineyard every year, and that gives us wonderful grapes and wine to work with when we make the Mariner every year. So there's a lot of sort of these building block vineyards that are just cornerstones for the Mariner year after year. So it's wonderful.
Fun fact, not to interrupt you in there, Brian, but for those of you who were on our virtual tasting last month, while Dave and Kim were talking about the first vintage of reds, the Long vineyard was that 1974 Merlot. So the first Merlot vineyard that we ever sourced from. So now it's the second generation who is growing the fruit for us. So when we're talking about long-term family relationships, that absolutely is a priority for us for that vineyard. So Brian, I know we have a question in the chat about the differences between Hungarian and French oak. I'm not sure if maybe you can tie that into the 2018, because I'm not sure when you want to switch over to that vintage, but maybe you could touch on that with the next one.
Yeah, absolutely. So the differences between Hungarian and French is it's really a different species of tree. we use in the winery as a whole, we use American oak, French oak, and Hungarian. Each of those are slightly different species of oak tree. Hungarian and French are very similar, whereas American of the three is a little bit more unique. Also with the locations of the forests where the Hungarian and French oak is grown, those are also a little bit more similar as well. French and Hungarian are both tighter grained relative to American. French is slightly tighter grained than Hungarian, but that is very relative. There's plenty of oak staves that comprise these Hungarian oak barrels that may be tighter grained than another. Really what it comes down to for me is, like, we could kind of get into the genealogy of the oak trees. That's not that exciting even to me, but it's really about what is the impact on the wine, what's the flavor. And French oak just has a wonderful classic impact. It provides a little bit of structure in the palate, and you actually get a little bit of tension. French oak often has a real classic sort of cocoa powder, or even a chocolatey impact that it can have, and a very pleasant, subtle toastiness. So French oak is just a mainstay in our Bordeaux program, as well as our Zinfandel program. Hungarian oak is very similar in that it's not super impactful. Both French and Hungarian oak, they don't add, they're not overly sweet, overly toasty. They're very respectful of the fruit, because we really want the vineyard, the terroir, some of the uniqueness of the growing site and those flavors that are in the grapes and the wine on their own. We don't want them to be masked by the oak. And so French and Hungarian oak both do that. I think Hungarian oak adds a little bit of sweetness. Its sort of tannin and texture is a little softer than French oak. And Hungarian oak often adds a lot of real pleasant spices, kind of like your baking spices, like nutmeg, cardamom. It can impart a touch of like the perception of sweetness, almost like marzipan. And so it's really, Hungarian is really a wonderful oak on Cabernet, Merlot, all, Malbec, Cabernet Franc, Petit, all the varietals we're talking about, in addition to Zinfandel. So we love Hungarian oak, and using both of those really allows us to maximize quality and provide that consistency that we're talking about. If you have a vintage where the tannins are a little tighter, or maybe a slightly harsher tannin, maybe a little Hungarian oak would be more useful there, because that sort of perception of sweetness that I sometimes talk about, it can have a softening effect on those tannins. Whereas if you were just going 100% French oak, it might not marry well with a vintage that has a little bit higher tannin, or maybe a cooler vintage that might have a little more tension in the palate. If it was 100% French oak, it might create a little bit of a challenge. So that's kind of how we use the different oaks and some different toast profiles there. And it's really about, we're making a wine that we want to enjoy. We want it to smell good, taste good, be enjoyable, be a pleasant texture on the palate, and again, high quality, consistency, vintage to vintage, and fruit sourcing, our barrel regime. All of these are layers that add in flavors, aromas, and we've been doing it a while. So that's where the consistency comes. We've really figured out what works with these vineyards, what works with these different wines. And now it's just kind of every year we just try to, kind of take it up another level. So moving on to the 2018 vintage, I'm really enjoying this wine. I've had a couple sips of it and been smelling it a little bit. This has developed really nicely in the bottle, and it's opening up really great in my glass right now. 2018 was in general, relative to 2017, relative to even average year, much cooler vintage. So we had some cooler weather. You can certainly see that right off the top with the alcohol percentage. You can see on your labels, it's 13.9%. So lower alcohol, which translates to harvesting the grapes a little earlier. I have an average of 24.2 bricks, which is fancy term for sugar level. So basically the sugar didn't climb as high that vintage, and it was a cooler year overall. We also had some challenging weather that sort of came in and sort of influenced our harvest plans. So there was some rain that came in kind of in the middle of the vintage. And so fortunately for us, and Bordeaux varietals do handle rain really well. Cabernet Sauvignon, all 5 of these varieties, they have a little bit thicker skin and they can really hold up to rain. So we weren't as worried about these varietals, some of that rain that came in. Zinfandel and Petit Syrah and Sauvignon Blanc, they don't like rain so much. So we were really hustling to get some of those varieties harvested, but we knew that these varieties that go into Mariner, that they could handle it out in the vineyard a little bit longer. And so there was some light rain that came in the middle of harvest. So we really hustled to get the Zinfandel and Petit Syrah harvested. And then we let these Bordeaux varietals hang just a little bit longer. They kind of dried out with some of that rain. And then once the rain settled, we started harvesting them again. Now, what happened was with the weather and kind of being a little bit cooler, not having those typical warm, sunny days, it kept the sugar really moderate. So we didn't see that warm weather pushing the sugar really high, which kept the bricks lower, which translated to that lower alcohol I was just talking about. We did, however, get enough hang time that they were still able to get fully ripe. Now, it didn't translate to higher sugar, but we got some really nice color. The grapes fully matured. And so we got those wonderful riper fruit flavors like black currant and black cherry. The tannins softened out a little bit, because if you harvest Bordeaux varietals too soon, the tannins can be really harsh. You almost need the tannins to actually get ripe, and not just the color and the flavor and everything. And it all really goes hand in hand. With that cooler weather, even though we didn't get quite as ripe as maybe in 2017, we got enough to get the fruit and flavor and everything. The one difference that I do see is there's a little bit more complexity in the wine. There's a touch more kind of sort of gravelly, earthy notes, a touch more of that leather, a touch more of those dried herbs, kind of maybe some oregano or dried thyme. Those are components that come with Cabernet Sauvignon. Cabernet Franc in particular. Those varieties have a little bit more of that herbal component. Black olive is also a flavor and aroma that we get in these varieties. When the grapes are much less ripe, those sort of other flavors and aromas are heightened, and you have less fruit. When you let these varieties hang on the vine much longer and get what I would call overripe, you really only have a very simple kind of cherry jam, and you don't get any of these wonderful herbal and earthy complexities there. So that's what I see the difference between 2017 and 2018. 2018 still has plenty of fruit. I'm very happy with that. I was also really pleased that the palate is softened. It's already very approachable and very drinkable. It's not like the palate or the tannins are too hard. And so overall, I'm very happy with that. And I think there is sort of that consistent profile that the Mariner is known for, where the fruit flavors and aromas are very similar. We were just talking about the oak a little bit. Whereas the 2017 was 42% new oak. We used a touch more new oak. In the 2018, we used 44%. That was really just, there wasn't really any magic science with that. That was really about what tastes better. And that's where Tim, myself, Laura, when we're blending in the lab and we're doing these trial blends, there's a lot of science that goes with it. There's a lot of, consistency that I'm talking about, and kind of like, what do we do? What makes this wine good? How have we made the Mariner in the past? But when we get to the point where we're finally blending, it's really about what tastes better, what smells better. And so we will pull previous vintages to kind of make sure we're consistent. But that difference in oak for that wasn't really tied into some magic difference that we saw in the growing season. That was really just that little bit of extra new oak just added that bit of complexity, a little bit of chocolatiness there that we really wanted to go for. It's really about elevating the wine. We kind of like to use enough new oak to really elevate the fruit. And you do find that as you add a little bit more oak, you'll kind of bring out more flavors and aromas that are present in the wine that maybe aren't there in neutral barrels and older barrels. But there becomes a tipping point where if you have too much new oak, it starts to mask the wine, and you actually start to just smell and taste oak and not just the wine. And so that's kind of how we make some of those decisions. But overall, really happy with the 2018. It also has a nice pH at 3.57, which again, that number doesn't necessarily need to mean anything to you other than it's a very stable wine, it's very healthy, and it's built to age. And so I see the 2018 aging very nicely for years to come.
Brian, that's actually a question that I've gotten in the chat a little bit from some private chats is, since this has a little bit higher acidity, does that mean that it could potentially age a little bit longer? I mean, I know you and I have been tasting a lot of library wines this year in celebration for the 50th anniversary. And what we're really noticing is those great high acidic wines have a longer ageability. Do you have any thoughts on that, or kind of where this would fall in the scheme of these three wines?
Yeah, I mean, the acidity and the pH is a major factor in ageability. Tannin also, as a rule of thumb for me, just when I'm kind of putting, more thinking of as more of a consumer and less a winemaker, if a wine that I taste is very high in acid and it's very tannic, like you kind of have that astringent texture on your palate when you taste the wine, that tells me that wine, for my taste, it needs to age a little bit longer to kind of soften out and mellow out. But it also makes me feel comfortable putting that on the shelf, putting it in my cellar, in my wine fridge, and knowing that it's going to be fine for years to come. So kind of, I hope I'm answering the question, Sarah, but like the 2018 right now, it's drinkable, it's very nice, but I get some of that acidity, I get a little bit of that tension on the tannin, and so I think it could age longer. And it's a difficult question to answer because everyone's palate's a little bit different. Like my wife, who's also a winemaker, she really prefers her wines fresher. She likes to drink them younger. She loves that wonderful primary fruit that really we have with all of these. So she really likes that. She would prefer for that still to be there. So she likes to drink her wines a little bit younger. I have a lot of friends and family who they're on the other side where they like it to be more soft and more mellow. That little bit of edge that you get from the acidity and the tannin in its youth, they like it to be a little more silky, a little more smooth. Maybe they like some of the flavors here's a good example. I might be going off on a tangent, but stay with me. So when with red wines in particular, when they are very young, like we've finished primary fermentation, like the 2021 vintage, for example, right now, we have it out in barrel. We have it in these wood tanks right behind me here. So when it's at the early stage of its aging process, there's a lot of candied flavor. So let's just isolate it to one fruit. Let's take cherry. So when it's really, really young, it tastes almost like candied cherry, like a red cherry Jolly Rancher, very, very young. As it develops in barrel, maybe we blend a little new oak into it, we get ready to bottle, it gets a little more complex where it becomes really a perfectly ripe cherry, maybe a slightly riper black cherry. That fruit sort of darkens, and as we add a little bit of new oak, it gets even darker and richer. And that's how it is when it gets bottled in the first few years of bottling. If you let that sit in the bottle 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, that cherry starts to get riper and darker, where maybe it starts to be like a cherry you've had in your fridge a little bit, where the skin starts to get maybe just ever so saggy on it. And then it goes even further, it becomes a dried cherry. When if you let it go further and further and further, it becomes a cherry that's so dry that doesn't have much flavor at all, right? And that's kind of how, in terms of fruit profile, that's kind of how these wines develop a little bit. So it becomes a lot of knowing your own palate, knowing your own personal preference in terms of flavor and aroma. What do you really like? There's a lot of people that really will gobble up dried cherries and they don't really want to mess with fresh cherries. And so it kind of becomes a little bit knowing what you like. Now I'm isolating one particular fruit flavor and aroma, but I'm just trying to kind of give an example, because it becomes, for me, when I make the decision on when I want to open a wine, it's a mix of all that. It's what is the flavor like, but what is the texture like, and so and I think people know that without even knowing they know that. It's like they really like the wine that's aged for a bit and it's softened and it has a little bit more maturity, whereas other people taste a wine that's a 15 or 20-year-old wine and they go, oh, I don't like that at all. And I know I've had that experience at a table where someone pulls out a real special bottle of wine and 10 of us are sitting around a table, and 6 people like it and 4 people don't, and you know what I mean. That's sort of how it goes. So it becomes a little bit of knowing your own sort of palate and your own personal preference in terms of aging wines, and kind of giving yourself an idea of how it's going to go. But I think Sarah's initial question was kind of like, would this sort of acid and tannin level, does it inform you in making those decisions? And I think it does. I think if a wine is really high in acid and, you know, some higher tannins, then you could trust that it could age and last longer. So if you're a person that really likes to sort of push them longer and age them more, then that'd be a wine you say, okay, you put it on that shelf, that this is the 10-year shelf. We don't touch this for 10 years or whatever. And what I really think the best way to do, and what I personally do, because I kind of appreciate younger, mid, and older wines, is I like to buy 3 or 4 or 5 bottles if I can, and I drink 1 or 2 in their youth, and then I have one that I open after 5-7 years, and you kind of know, like, if you open after 5-7 years and it's perfect, it's like, well, then open all of it. But sometimes you open it, you're like, that's still got a little liveliness to it. There's still a little youth in there, and then you kind of maybe keep it on that shelf and save it for a later date to open it. And I think that's for me, that's been the best way to do it.
Awesome. Why don't we move to the 2019, and then I'll pepper you with some more questions.
Good.
One thing that I'm not really sure, did we go over why we call this wine the Mariner?
I don't think we did. No, not yet. That's a good point. I'm seeing another question here. I'll touch on it. Okay. Bring that one up to me in a sec, Sarah. So why do we call it the Mariner? It's funny. I've touched on a little bit in my own head, because this is what we go through in reality as winemakers. But part of the reason we call it the Mariner is it's, if you were sailing a vessel out across the ocean, you'd meet a lot of challenges along the way, getting from your starting point to your destination. There's weather, there's all these different things that come at you, and you just kind of have to roll with it. And I think that's and this is my kind of Sarah has the official marketing version. This is my slang version of it, but it's really part of the reason they named it the Mariner was that it's very representative of what we face as winemakers during harvest, is that we don't know what the weather is going to be like. I talked about some of that rain and some of that cooler weather that we had in the 2018 vintage. We don't know what's going to come to us, or the heat spike that we had in 2017. And so you really need to be prepared for whatever challenges you're going to face, because every vintage is different. We often have some similarities from year to year, but no two are really ever the same. And so this is a real fitting name for this wine, because we have the end goal of having this wine have a certain character, have a certain consistency, like I keep talking about. And to achieve that, you really have to overcome some challenges, and you really have to navigate that route in a particular way. And so I think it's a fitting name for it, because no two vintages are the same, no two voyages are the same. And so it's really about getting to your end destination, meeting your end goal, and making this final blend as good as it can be. That's where we want to end up. And while we may take very different routes to get there, I think we do a good job at ending up where we need to be year after year. So 2019. I want to go back to one thing on the 2018. I'll kind of jump into 2019, just the varietal, because I think the varietal percentage is a key thing in making this wine, and kind of how we navigate that voyage. So the 2018 is wonderful image there. 68% Cabernet Sauvignon, 13% Merlot, 8% Malbec, 8% Petit Verdot, 3% Cab Franc. So I talked about it being a cooler year. It was a little higher in acidity. In cooler years, you generally have a slightly less color. So you see Cabernet Sauvignon and Petit Verdot being pretty high percentages relative to other years, relative to the 2017, or at least the Petit Verdot. The Cabernet Sauvignon is pretty consistent, but the Petit Verdot is a higher percentage. Merlot is slightly down a couple percent. Cabernet Franc is down a few percent. So Petit Verdot is a very dark grape, provides a lot more color. That was why we used a little bit more Petit Verdot in 2018 to really hit that classic rich color that we're going for. As we pivot to 2019, 2019 was a fantastic growing year. Really wonderful warm weather, a little bit more moderate. So we were able to kind of really harvest grapes at their optimum ripeness. So you see 61% Cabernet Sauvignon, 18% Merlot, 11% Malbec, still 8% Petit Verdot, and 2% Cabernet Franc. So we kept the Petit Verdot consistent, wonderful, really nice dark color. We actually upped the percentage on the Merlot. The Merlot in 2019 was just wonderfully balanced and ripe. That moderate weather really allowed us to have a lot of hang time. And so hang time is just, our term for allowing the grapes to stay on the vine longer and harvest them at a slightly later date. So the 2019 harvest we harvested for 70 days from kind of first harvest to last grapes harvested. And what that is sort of signifies is that very moderate weather. So we didn't have a bunch of heat spikes. We didn't have rain that forced us to pick grapes earlier. We were really able to pick and choose what vineyards and what varieties to harvest at sort of optimum levels. And so the Merlot was just wonderful that year. And because we were allowed longer hang time, it achieved a lot of color. Sometimes higher percentages of Merlot can actually, it's not a very dark or thick-skinned grape. So if you use a lot more Merlot, you can actually observe a color change. And it's less, color is a visual thing. It's a lot of its richness and texture. And that Merlot had such wonderful richness and texture that it really just helped the blend so much. And so that's why you almost see like a kind of a swap in percentage of a little less Cabernet Sauvignon and a little bit more Merlot. For 2019 relative to 2018, slightly higher bricks. We're at 25.4 bricks. The pH was also slightly higher. Which normally translates to a little less acidity, but the grapes are always a little different from year to year. And so we still have a lot of nice acidity at that higher pH. What it usually translates to, not to get too technical, but the grapes have a certain level of potassium in them. Potassium really affects the pH. And so that year there was slightly more potassium while still a high level of tartaric acid, which is the primary acid in grapes. So that's why we achieved a very balanced wine with still a lot of freshness and bright acid, but the pH is slightly higher. I hope I didn't go too sideways on everyone there. Sarah's always good at reeling me in when I get too technical.
Your translator.
That's right. So we aged the wine a little bit longer for the 2019 vintage. We went an extra couple months in barrel, and that was really just evaluating how the wine was developing. We had wonderful, rich, big tannins in 2019, so a little extra aging in barrel sort of moderated those tannins. We also went with slightly more new oak. Again, that's more of just a blending decision, a little bit more flavor, a little more richness. And so we really like that extra bit of new oak. The 2019 vintage, generally we had a lot of real good concentration, good weight, good richness in the mid palate. And so when you have a vintage like that, it can typically hold up a little bit better to more new oak. And so that's why we used a little bit more there. But yeah, so those are some of the differences. 2019 has been a fantastic year across the board on red wines. Having that sort of moderate weather that I was just touching on really allows those harvest decisions to be a little more simple for us, where it's really you're picking grapes when that vineyard is ideally ripe, like I had mentioned earlier. And so it allows you to have this great color and kind of that ideal we sort of have an ideal level of maturity, which really translates to mid palate weight. And I think the 2019 vintage as a whole has really nice richness and concentration in the mid palate without being overly tannic or drying or astringent.
So one thing, Brian, I think that would be really interesting for people to know is, for a wine like this, you have 5 different grapes, right? Well, how many different lots are you blending together? Like, what's your blending process? How many iterations do you go through to come up for this final blend?
Oh Man, in short, a lot. So I'm thinking, so we do our blend sheets on Excel. So we have a Excel. It's just a really basic spreadsheet with, volumes and percentages. The Mariner is always the longest Excel document, because we're breaking up each of those components because of all these, for the 2019, for example, there's 17 different vineyards that are contributing to this. We ferment all these vineyards separately. Some of these vineyards, we harvest multiple blocks separately. So even of some of these that it's one of 17 vineyards, well, that one vineyard of 17 could have 3 different fermentations in it. Within each of those 3 fermentations, there's neutral barrels, barrels that have been filled once, and then different types of new oak. So you can kind of see, as I'm sort of laying this out, that the multitude of options, the variables that are there it really can be endless. You can almost, if for us, we're very familiar with the vineyards, we're familiar with the barrels that we like, we know what fits really well in this profile, but you could spin yourself out of control with the many variables. It could be endless. So what it takes a lot of, tasting these vineyards, varieties, tasting these different barrel components over the years. So we've aged 18 to 20 months in barrel. So we're tasting these periodically throughout their life. And as they get closer to being ready to be blended, we're tasting them more and more and more. And so we pull samples from all these barrels, from all these different vineyards, we grade them. And so we really have an idea of which vineyards are stronger that vintage, maybe which block within that vineyard was stronger than another. And then we kind of pick the barrels that we like. And so we have an idea of which wines we really like. And so those first rounds of blending, Sarah asked a simple question. It's probably about 40 to 50, 55 different lines on that spreadsheet. Now, that's a few of those lines may be from the same vineyard, but maybe just a different barrel or a different block. But it's 40 to 50 different components that go into the Mariner blend. And you're probably working with options of 70 or 80 different ones, but you're swapping one out for another. And so we really start with that first round of blending, is that we're really looking for, we'll do 3 or 4 different blends, and you try to make fairly significant differences. Like, oh, this DCV9 Cab and this Walcott Cabernet, these are just rock solid. We know they're going to be in there. But maybe one that you're not so sure of, you kind of have that in one blend, but not in another. And you really try to drill down on what's improving it, what's taking it away. Maybe something is more tannic or less tannic. So you're kind of looking for what those components are doing with the blend. And after doing that a few rounds, you really start to drill down on what's working and what isn't.
Yeah, so the Preston's asked a great follow-up question of then, what do you do with the lots that don't make the cut for the Mariner?
Right. Yeah, that's a good question. So like I said, when we do these, the Mariner blending, it really kind of is going in tandem with, Endeavor, but it kind of goes in tandem with the Terroir series. So we're trying to make sure that some of these that's really our top grade components, it really kind of goes to the Mariner first, because it can go so many different directions. And inevitably, we have enough barrels and we have enough really high quality options from each of these vineyards that Mariner can be covered. Mariner just has more of the endless possibilities, because it's not beholden to a single vineyard or a single region. So you almost have to take care of Mariner, and then the terroir wines really come together after that. And so they can really, and you have plenty of options because they're more focused. And then what's left over from that, we still have the Meritage Blend, which, like I said, is our right bank kind of Merlot based program. But again, the Meritage is Dry Creek Valley, much like the Mariner. And so it's not as, I use the term beholden. It doesn't have to be focused on specific regions. And then, what doesn't make the cut for these wines, or what doesn't fit perfectly in that blend, we have our Dry Creek Valley Cabernet Sauvignon. So anything that's not going into Endeavor and Mariner and Benchland and Iron Slopes and all the other wonderful Bordeaux wines. It goes into the Dry Creek Valley Cabernet Sauvignon. Some people hear that and they're like, oh, so the Dry Creek Cab, it's just the leftovers. I really look at it differently, that we are farming these grapes and we are making all these wines to be made for Mariner, to be made for the terroir wines. And then we just happen to have extra volume that then we can put in the Cabernet Sauvignon. So it's really the Cabernet Sauvignon blend is really the grapes are farmed, the wine's made, it's aged in barrels to really be a $50, $60, $70 bottle of wine. And then we happen to sell it for $32 or whatever we sell it for. I don't know those numbers. I know the oak percentage and the varietal, but I don't know the dollars. But yeah, because you really have to commit on the front end. You start, right now we have bud break where the grapevines are waking up, and they're, the 22 vintage is really already started. So the farming in the vineyard has already started, making harvest decisions. We're already purchasing barrels, and our barrels that are coming over from France, they're already starting to be made and be produced. And so we've committed to the vineyards, we've committed to the barrels. We're making harvest decisions, fermentation decisions, putting those wines down to barrel a year and a half before we ever blend it. And so all of these wines are really, we're really trying to make them to be for the Mariner and the terroir. And then volume wise, what doesn't fit in those goes into the Dry Creek Valley Cab.
So we made it almost the entire virtual tasting without someone asking about the fires.
Okay.
So let's go ahead and let's break it down.
Who broke the seal?
I know, the Gilberts, exactly. They're raising their hands. They were the ones that did the lucky question there. So their question was specifically, how have the California fires affected the upcoming vintage wines? But what I think is really important is that 2 out of the 3 of these wines were fire seasons. Right. So I think you can tell already that obviously, there are wines that are not impacted by the fires. But Brian, I'll let you take that on.
Yeah. So there's a few things there. I'll try to keep it as concise as I can. But I talked about so 2017 and 2019 are the years that Sarah's talking about. Those are 2 out of 3 years that there were wildfires in the general area. So for both those years, we had already harvested all the grapes prior to the fires getting going. So even though we did have fires during that fall, during that harvest season, we had already harvested all of our fruit. So the grapes were not affected. That's something that's a bit of a benefit to us. I talked about, we're not looking to make wines that are really high in alcohol and then rely on residual sugar to balance them out. We really believe in harvesting grapes at that optimal level of ripeness and balance, where there's still a lot of natural acidity. It's much more, that really all came from Dave and Kim, that we're making wines that are a little bit more, they're very much California, the terroir and the area we're making, Dry Creek Valley, we're in California, we're dealing with our weather. But it's a little bit of a French and European influence with not having them be overly ripe, overly made, overly oaked, a little bit more restraint and balance to really let the vineyard shine through. So what that means is that we harvest the grapes a little bit earlier. So 2017 and 2019, grapes were fully harvested before the fires. Sadly, many of the other wineries in the area and in Napa, they still had grapes out on the vine. So they had a very different situation in those years, which is unfortunate. But yeah, so those years weren't affected. 2020 was a different year. The fires were much earlier. So that required a whole different regime and protocol for maintaining quality and making harvest decisions. We got to get Tim and Kim and I, we sat down and we got together and we just had to come up with a plan. And we just said, first and foremost, we don't want to harvest grapes and make wine out of anything that's compromised, anything that's going to be smoke impact or much less smoke tainted. So what that required of us as a winemaking team was to do massive amounts of sampling and analysis. And what it basically ended up being was all of the most up-to-date research the best methods to figure out whether your fruit is compromised to actually do what they call micro ferments. So basically, you harvest grape clusters, 10, 15, 20 pounds of grapes. You pull them off the stems, put them in a bucket, add yeast, and you do a fermentation, a small fermentation, a micro ferment. So we had Sarah, I think I tried to put it out of my memory because I have PTSD, but what's the number, Sarah? Was it like 147 or 100 and
it was in the hundreds.
it was like it
We
was
had
like
pop-up tents in the cellar, and they had
it was like
hundreds of
150
5-gallon buckets of fermenting wines to make sure that every lot was perfect. It was
So what you do is you ferment it, and then because a lot of those smoke markers, those smoke compounds, they're bound with sugar, and so it's not until the sugar ferments that is unbound, and then you can actually smell and taste it. So grape analysis gives you a little indicator, but it's really not until you do a fermentation and actually have the presence of alcohol and you've broken that sugar bond that you can actually smell and taste some of those smoke compounds. So what that translated to in 2020 was the good news is that the white grapes really weren't affected, because when you make white wine, you press the grapes and you ferment the juice away from the skins. The smoke compounds really embed themselves in the skins themselves. So we were thrilled with how the white wines came out. They're really not affected at all, and those whites turned out just as good as any of the vintages before or after. The reds were a different story. We found that they did show up in some of those certain vineyards, in some of those micro fermentations. And so then it was really a matter of how much is it there? How bad is it? And, in the end, anything that we didn't feel confident would come through clean in the ferment, we made the really difficult decision to not harvest those vineyards. And it really was not being dramatic. It was really heartbreaking. It was very hard, because we have a lot of we're heavily invested in our growers. We really consider them part of the family, and so to go to a grower that you've been buying grapes from for many years and to tell them you can't harvest their grapes is a tough thing to do, and it's tough for them to hear, but it's we're invested in them, and they're invested in us, and they know that we can't make wine that's going to be disappointing, that's not going to hold up our standard of quality. And fortunately, through crop insurance and some various things, we all kind of got through it together. But we feel, even though we weren't able to make as much wine as we would have liked in 2020, we feel good about the wines that we have made, and they're turning out very nicely. The Old Vines Zinfandel is the first red wine that we bottled, and it turned out fantastic, really nice. So that's kind of the fire challenge, and 2021 was a great year, and we were not affected by fires in 21, and we're hoping for the same for 22.
Well, and so then going back to Carol's question, which I know she was wondering, how long did you have your wine in the glasses tonight before you started tasting? And it probably wasn't the recommended time to air out a wine. So what would your ideal be?
Oh, right. Jenny, how long did I have the wines in the glass before? What, probably 15 or 20 minutes? Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, 15, 20 minutes. So yeah, I mean, they're all smelling and tasting pretty nice. I mean, it's enough for them to open up a little bit. But as we've been on for an hour, I can even notice that some of the wines have opened up more and more, particularly the 18 and 19. A little more complex aromatics that are coming out of them. Again, that's sort of it's kind of there's no. It's a little bit of your best judgment. Some people like their wines to open up a little bit more. A hearty red wine like the Mariner, even the 2017, because it's not, it's still relatively young. If I was at home, I probably wouldn't feel the need to decant these necessarily, but I'd probably open them for 20 or 30 minutes. Yeah, because I mean, I'm a little bit different. There's part of me almost likes, when they, not quite open, and smelling and tasting it, and kind of letting the glass sit there for a little bit, and then revisiting it and being like, okay, now it's really coming alive. But if you were serving and you're really wanting to impress people, I'd probably open it at least 20 or 30 minutes before. I usually wouldn't go over an hour. There's a little risk in that, it's too much of a good thing, I guess. Yeah. Oh, one question that we had, I don't know if I touched on the temperature question. Did I, Sarah?
Well, I don't know if you did. Yeah, Carol.
Yeah, somebody had asked a question in advance about what temperature to serve red wines at, which is a really good question, because there's sort of the common saying that everyone has is you serve them at room temperature. And that's been the thing people have said for many, many years, but room temperature in different regions at different times of year is very different. And so I tend to think that room temperature, when they first came up, that room temperature was room temperature in like an old English castle made of stone, because ideal temperature is really, there's a range, but kind of 60 to 68 degrees is about the ideal temperature for red wine. I store my wines at 55 degrees, 55 to 58. And so, when I'm at home, I like to pull the bottle out a little in advance and let the bottle itself warm up. But then I personally also like it to be in that 60 to 68 range. And white wines also, sometimes you don't want a white wine crazy cold. If it's really chilled, some of the aromatics are a little muted. It's not until it warms up that they really come out. And if the aromatics are muted, you can almost guarantee the flavor is a little bit too. It's also really relative to the environment in which you're serving and enjoying the wine, right? Like if you're outside on a hot summer day, it's like you might be, keeping the white wine in an ice bucket and just pouring out for a little sip. I've poured wine at events where it's warm weather, and we had the red wine in ice buckets, and you're rotating it so that it's not getting too warm, but at the same time you don't want to keep in the bucket too long, so you're kind of rotating bottles in and out. But yeah, slightly cooler than what our typical room temperature is, because most of our homes are warmer than that 60 to 68. But yeah, that's kind of serving temperature.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Brian, for jumping in on these virtual tastings. It's been awesome to have you on here. Couple quick reminders again for everybody, all my regulars on here. Our next tasting, the one I said on May 24th, that's a Tuesday. So we've done every other tasting on a Thursday. This one is a Tuesday. So I'm telling you now, so you can't be upset if you tune on Thursday instead of Tuesday. So we did have to switch it up because everything is coming back to life now and our schedules are getting a little crazy, but we're committed to being here and doing virtual tastings. So Tuesday, May 24th, that's with Kim and Tim, Sparkling Shannon, 50th anniversary Cabernet. Absolutely do not miss that one.
That's going to be awesome.
It's going to be so good.
Those wines are phenomenal. They're just tasting so great. And we're really excited they're being released. You guys are going to enjoy that. You're going to enjoy the virtual tasting and just having these wines.
Absolutely. And for all my newer people, I see some new faces here, which is absolutely fantastic. You can check out our YouTube channel. We have most of our previous virtual tastings on there. So if you want to know more about barrels, for example, Tim Bell did a great virtual tasting, I believe about a year ago for February, that really goes into how barrels are made. We have some other of our old vines in verticals. So we have a lot of fun stuff on our YouTube channel too, to be able to check out if you want to get more in depth as we keep moving on to different topics throughout the year. If you have different topics, please let me know. I always love hearing your ideas as we're putting stuff together. And then I did get a little private chat that I'm just going to do out in the public here of, I don't know when the Christmas dinner tickets will become available, but I'm sure that we will have them. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to make sure that we give a little countdown of when tickets will be available so everyone has a fair shake, so that it's not, you just didn't miss your email and you missed out on the ticket. So when we send an email that says the countdown is going, pay attention to that and set a little alarm so you can make sure you get your tickets for the Christmas dinner. We also, just for those of you, gosh, I have a lot of announcements. I'm so sorry. But you guys are like my people and I want you to know all these fun things. So for those of you who were able to take advantage of our 1983 gift set that we just released, we will also be releasing another one in May. That's a different 2-bottle library set. But it's 1994, I believe, that we're going to be doing a 2-bottle set from 94. So again, watch out for that if that's something you're interested in, especially as we're talking about how to age wines and how to store wines. It's a really fun opportunity to get a piece of history because we're not going to sell them again, most likely. So watch out for that. I think that's all my announcements for the moment. Thank you so much for sharing your evening with us. We can't wait to see you either in person or on a virtual tasting again. Please send us your questions if you have them for the next time, and have a wonderful night. Cheers, everybody.